Did you learn about the separation of powers when you were a kid? How do we know when the president's allowed to exercise a power that's not listed as one of his own? I think most of us learned about the separation of powers, but drop me a comment and let me know if you learned about the non-delegation doctrine. Because even though this rule was mostly abandoned in the early 1900s, it is still operating today in a few ways, including telling us how to figure out when Congress is allowed to delegate a power to the president and how to interpret that delegation. And this is really important stuff because this stuff is happening a lot right now. I'm Brian, I make videos about civics and law. Please watch this video. This is really important. And comment, like, repost so that other people can learn this too. Alex, Mary, and Virginia, thank you so much for getting me stuff off of my Amazon wish list. If you guys want to support me, there are ways to do it in my link tree. And I can't do this without support. Okay, this is not easy, but I'm going to try to break this down so that it's digestible. Let's start with the Articles of the Constitution. The first three Articles of the Constitution set up three different branches of government and delegate powers to each one. The legislature has this power, and this power, and this power. The executive has power number 1, power number 2, power number 3, etc. These are called the enumerated powers. Enumerated as in numbered. 1, 2, 3. It's a list of powers, even though there's actually no numbers in here. Now, the separation of powers doctrine tells us that there are walls between these branches. And separation of powers tells us that these branches are not allowed to reach across the walls and steal powers. But separation of powers has a cousin called the non-delegation doctrine. And the non-delegation doctrine reinforces these walls by saying not only can the executive not reach across and grab anything from the legislature, but the legislature also isn't allowed to reach across and give anything to the executive. These enumerated powers are not allowed to be delegated. And we stuck by this rule for a good 100-something years. But sometime around the late 1800s, early 1900s, we kind of softened on it. And eventually we mostly did away with it altogether. But there are shadows of it still hanging around, and they particularly influence how we interpret the process by which powers are delegated. Now, key to this discussion is that back when the Constitution was being written, the sharing of powers was a key concern. James Madison said in Federalist number 48, "The powers properly belonging to one of the departments ought not to be directly and completely administered by either of the other departments." So even if we're going to allow some of these powers to be shared across the line, we need to make sure that the original holder of those powers still has control of them. And that's going to be the key to what I'm about to show you. All right, I'm going to clean this up so it's a little bit easier to look at. And we're going to talk about legislative power number 3. It's just an example, you don't need to look it up. Now, based solely on the Constitution and a firm reading of the non-delegation doctrine, the legislature can exercise power number 3, that's why it's in green. The executive cannot, it's in red. This is the legislature's power only. Now let's talk about how and why we delegate powers today. Sometimes Congress thinks up a situation that might come up where they might not be able to respond, and they're worried about it. Maybe it's something that'll happen fast and they'll need a quick response to it. Maybe it's something that could happen while they're out of session. And so they might delegate one of their powers to the president in case that situation arises. And they usually do it by writing a law that says, if this particular situation arises, we delegate our enumerated power to the president to deal with the situation in this way or that way. And if that situation ever comes up, the president can use the power that Congress has loaned him to fix whatever problem it is. So I'm going to make up an example that is silly and ridiculous, but I think illustrates my point. Because even though delegation might be important sometimes, it's still important to remember that that power has to remain in the hands of Congress. So how are we going to do that? Congress actually does have an enumerated power in Article 1 to take out credit on behalf of the United States. So let's say that that's legislative power number 3. But for our story, instead of like some kind of huge credit, we're going to say that Congress has an Amex Black Card. Just for our story. It's credit, right? Now, Congress is allowed to use that Amex Black Card for anything. That's in the green. But let's say Congress realizes that they're not usually here on the weekends. And sometimes the president has to entertain, and he's got his buddies coming over on the weekends when Congress is out of town. And so Congress says, tell you what, you can order pizza on our Amex Black Card this weekend. And they write a law that says the president may order $60 worth of pizza on our Amex Black Card on the weekend while we are out of town. And they call it the Pizza Act. And for the purposes of our story, we will say that ordering $60 worth of pizza on the Amex Black Card is perfectly within the power that's been delegated by the legislature to the executive under the Pizza Act. So we will put the pizza in green. So Congress goes out of town for the weekend. The president's all excited. He's got his buddies coming over and he goes to order pizza and he finds out that Duccini's in Adams Morgan closed early this weekend. So what's he gonna do? He's got people coming over, like he told them there would be food. Well, he checks and finds out that Walk and Roll is still open and they're about the same price. Under the Pizza Act, can the president order $60 worth of Chinese food on the Amex Black Card? Well, this is sort of a gray area, right? The law clearly says $60 worth of pizza, but $60 is $60, right? It's still food. What you're looking at here is the interpretation of a law. And the question becomes, do we interpret this law narrowly or broadly? Well, here's the problem. It's 11 p.m. on Friday night. Congress is gone. Whose decision is it whether this law applies to Chinese food or not? Only the president's. Which means that suddenly this power has gone from being Congress's power to being the president's power. Because Congress is in no way involved in the decision as to whether that Amex Black Card can be used to buy Chinese food or not. Now, presented with the question, they might not care, but they're never going to be asked the question, or at least not before the power is exercised. And that is never allowed. A power that is enumerated to one branch must remain in the hands of that branch. Even if they delegate it, it still must remain in their hands. So, any interpretation of a delegated power must be done narrowly. Does pizza mean food? No. Not with an enumerated power because of what's left of the non-delegation doctrine. Interpretations must always be narrow in this sort of a situation. Remember James Madison's words. If the power belongs to one branch, it cannot be completely administered by another branch. And by making the decision on his own, the president has taken over this power completely for himself. And that is not allowed. All right, here are the things I wanted you to walk away from here. An understanding of narrow versus broad interpretation, a general idea of what the non-delegation doctrine is. Even though it doesn't come up by name a ton, the principle's still lying there under a lot of the separation of powers discussions. And finally, we've talked a bit about enumerated powers before, but this is a very important concept to understand. Not only does it mean something specific, but it carries a lot of weight with it. Thanks to everybody who's been supporting me. I really appreciate your help. I can't do this without support. Please watch the whole video, comment, like, repost. Comment if you see any of this in the real world right now. And as usual, keep watching. I'll keep making them. Thanks a lot, guys.